Good evening. I'm so happy to be with you all here tonight. This is an exciting time for all of us who value human life from the moment of conception. In less than 6 months, the Supreme Court will issue its decision on the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization case. The last time an abortion case as consequential as Dobbs was decided, it was June 29th, 1992. I was 15 years old then. I remember riding with my grandfather, who was a family physician, in his little old Chevy Nova in rural Pennsylvania, a state whose legislature had passed several restrictions on abortion that Planned Parenthood had challenged in court. That case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Casey being Bob Casey, the pro-life Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, had made it all the way to the Supreme Court and was viewed by many as a potential vehicle to overturn Roe v. Wade, which had determined abortion to be a constitutional right just 19 years before. That day in 1992, the court upheld Roe v. Wade by a 5-4 vote. I remember how disappointed my grandfather was, how he talked about how most of the justices who had affirmed Roe that day basically acknowledged that there wasn't a sound legal case for finding abortion in the Constitution, but they believed overturning Roe would cause an unacceptable disruption to people's lives. In their own words, people, quote, have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion, unquote. And the court could not dismiss, quote, the certain costs of overruling Roe for people who have ordered their thinking and living around that case. So according to the Supreme Court, it didn't matter that abortion wasn't actually in the Constitution. What really mattered was that people thought it was in the Constitution. Now, 30 years later, looking at the Dobbs case before the court, we are blessed to have more justices who care about what the Constitution actually says. So the odds are better than they ever have been that the Supreme Court will reverse Roe v. Wade. Should that happen, what will the pro-life movement look like going forward? What should it look like? To help answer that question, it might be helpful to look back to what the pro-life movement was like before abortion was legalized. Abortion has been with us since before we were a nation, thousands of years before that. But back in colonial times, in the United States' first decades, abortion was not unheard of, but from what evidence we can gather, it wasn't particularly prevalent for several reasons. The first was socioeconomic. If you were an unwed mother and the father was also unwed, most localities compelled fathers to marry the mother. And at the edge of the Revolutionary War, as many as 1 out of every 3 Americans was actually conceived out of wedlock, but no more than 1 out of 15 was born without a married mother and father. The second was medical. The abortifacients used at the time, such as oil of Savin, rue, tansy oil, were often not effective. And if the dosage wasn't correct, could not only kill the child, but also kill the mother. The third was legal. Any effort to intentionally kill a child in the womb was a crime. Now, many of the laws specify that abortion was only a crime after quickening, which is when you can feel the child move in the womb. But those quickening laws existed in part because it was more difficult to prosecute an abortion before there was more tangible evidence of a pregnancy, not because there was any doubt that life was present before quickening. Until the early 19th century, many people actually believed children were preformed at a microscopic level in a man's sperm, and that their life was activated by being implanted in a woman's womb. Those who believed in this were called animalculists. As late as 1860, a popular American medical text stated that semen contains, quote, a vast number of animalcules, and that 1 or more of these is conveyed through the fallopian tubes to the uterus, and there becomes the fetus, and that the female performed no other function than that of nourishing the germ to reach a sufficient degree of development to be expelled. So even though early Americans did not know exactly how babies were formed, they clearly believed that a life began before any sign of quickening. It's virtually impossible to effectively estimate the actual number of abortions from this early time period, but from the incidence of abortion that we can find on the record, it seems clear that most abortions occurred among women who had little familial support and fell outside the local legal and societal support system. By the mid-19th century, several other developments that came primarily with industrialization led to greater opportunities for abortion. Increasing urbanization gave men opportunities to travel into cities with relative anonymity and seduce young women or indulge in brothels. Another factor driving potential abortions was the Spiritist movement of the mid-19th century, which encouraged people, married or unmarried, to engage in free love regardless of the consequences. Physician and former Spiritist Benjamin Hatch describes in 1859, quote, women who have abandoned their husbands and are living in adultery with their paramours produce abortion and arise from their guilty couches and stand before large audiences as the medium for angels, unquote. According to Hatch, spiritists say all natural passions must have ample scope to work themselves out in their true order. The hoops which have bound the past must be trampled underfoot, and a high and holy freedom must take their places. They boastingly speak of their freedom from what they call social conventionalism and the superstitions of Christianity. They plant themselves upon the instincts of their nature. They earnestly contend that no external authority and no code of human laws can justly bind their affections or interfere with their liberty to follow the impulse of their personal affinities. Spiritist Henry Wright said that a child's first claim is to a designed existence, if it is to exist at all. Only in such an existence can it hope for a true and noble nature, unquote. Now, this reflected belief that wasn't exclusive to spiritists, namely that the disposition of a child's parents and the circumstances under which the child was conceived would determine the child's nature and the quality of his or her life. But outside of seduced, abandoned women, prostitutes, spiritists, the vast majority of American women in the 19th century are very unlikely to have an abortion. The laws of the period and the values behind those laws were very clear on the immorality of abortion, if anything, became stronger. By 1868, 30 out of 37 states had anti-abortion laws on the books, and 27 of those 30 prohibited abortion before quickening. Now, the groups leading the pro-life movement in the mid to late 19th century were doctors and journalists. They were the ones making the moral case against abortion that led to many of these laws. Dr. Hugh Hodge, speaking to his medical students at the University of Pennsylvania, said the unborn child is, quote, an independent being with its own independent powers, unquote. Writing in 1853, in his book, The Mother and Her Offspring, Dr. Stephen Tracy wrote, quote, if examined 3 to 4 weeks from the commencement of pregnancy, the embryo will be found to have about the size of a grain of wheat. It is a human being. It is one of the human family as really and truly as if it had lived 6 months or 6 years. Consequently, its life should be as carefully and tenderly cherished, unquote. And then there were several persistent pushes by major newspapers in the late 19th century to combat abortion. In the 1870s, the New York Times, led by editor Louis Jennings, a conservative Christian, proclaimed abortion, quote, the evil of the age, unquote, and published several exposés on the practice of abortionists in New York, including assigning a reporter to go undercover with a lady friend who posed as a couple looking for abortion services. When abortionists in New York were arrested, the New York Times gave them front-page coverage. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune also employed its editorial firepower to attack abortion. In one column entitled The Root of the Evil, the Tribune described abortion as, quote, an infamous but unfortunately common crime, so common that it affords a lucrative support to a regular guild of professional murderers. The Springfield Republican in Massachusetts criticized, quote, the disposal made of infant life, both before and after birth. Where were churches in all this? With the exception of the Presbyterian Church, no major Protestant denomination explicitly condemned abortion in the 19th century. Now, there were certainly some clergymen that were willing to speak out against it. For instance, Episcopalian Bishop Arthur Cox in 1869 wrote in a pastoral letter about, quote, the blood guiltiness of antenatal infanticide, and spoke of abortion as, quote, the practical results of the sacrifices to Moloch which defile our land, unquote. But churches were largely reluctant to speak about abortion. A primary reason is the too sad reality that there were sufficient numbers of Christians in the pews, and even the pulpit, who were guilty of procuring an abortion, and thus many pastors were unwilling to stir that pot. Now, even though many churches themselves were not keen on addressing abortion, there were a variety of Christian charitable organizations who were working to meet the needs of pregnant, unmarried women. Group homes for women were set up in cities like New York and Chicago. In New York, representatives from these homes would go to train stations to meet young single women who might be alone and vulnerable. Some of these groups that would help women find respectable lodging had names like the Association for Befriending Children and Young Girls, the New Shelter for Young Women, and the Free Home for Young Girls. And then there were group homes specifically for unmarried, pregnant women that would allow women to care for their children and help them place those children to adoptive families if they so chose. These included groups like the House of Mercy, the Magdalene Benevolent Society, and the Heartsease Work for Friendless Women. By 1895, Chicago had at least a dozen shelters for pregnant and unmarried women, including the Life and Hope Mission, Beulah House, and the Boynton Refuge Home. Then in the early 1900s, the progressive movement began arguing that abortion was a compassionate action because the world did not need more poor mouths to feed, reflecting overpopulation concerns at the time. We have the opposite problem now. This progressive ideology started to infiltrate the church. Many mainline Protestant churches that weren't directly speaking out about abortion in the past were adopting a more theologically liberal approach that put less emphasis on God's sovereignty and revelation and more emphasis on man's ability to shape a better world, which came to include shaping what children would or should not be born. As we moved into the 1960s, this value in particular became predominant. Quote, "The authority of each individual soul is absolute and final in deciding questions as to what is true or false in principle and right or wrong in practice." This line could be a quote from any progressive today, but it's from a Spiritist convention in 1858. Though abortion was illegal at that time and repudiated by most of the population, if we factor in everything we know about who was having abortions in the mid-19th century, we can estimate that on the eve of the Civil War, there were approximately 160,000 abortions a year, with a population of just over 30 million. That's about 0.5% of the population. By comparison, the number of reported abortions in the United States in 2017, the most recent year that we have relatively reliable numbers, is 862,320, which is about 0.26% of the 2017 population of 325 million. The sad reality is Christians in America were not nearly as effective as they needed to be and could have been in curtailing abortion in the decades before Roe v. Wade. And while we can be thankful that our laws used to strongly reflect the immorality of abortion, the reality is they were difficult to enforce. Just as an example, looking at Washington, D.C., between 1905 and 1909, in those 5 years, thousands of abortions were performed in our nation's capital. But in those 5 years, there were only 9 indictments and only 3 convictions. In order to get a conviction, you usually needed the woman's testimony. Unless something went wrong with the abortion or the procedure damaged the woman's health severely, there would be little incentive for women to testify. And the penalties that came with the conviction were relatively light, ranging from about 2 to 10 years in prison. Part of the reason they were light was, again, the difficulty in gathering enough testimony and evidence for conviction. If you're interested in learning more about this pre-Roe v. Wade abortion history we've been discussing here tonight, I strongly recommend to you World Magazine editor Marvin Olasky's book, Abortion Rights. Rights spelled R-I-T-E-S. Looking forward now again to the Dobbs case this year. If Roe v. Wade is overturned, which would send abortion policy back to the states, abortion would almost immediately be either severely restricted or illegal in 19 states. A dozen states have trigger laws that would eliminate abortion, with limited exceptions such as rape, incest, or life of the mother. Those states include Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Utah. 5 other states have abortion bans still in the books that predate Roe: Alabama, Arizona, Michigan, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. And 2 other states have heartbeat laws that would ban abortion upon detection of a heartbeat as early as 6 weeks into a pregnancy: Georgia and South Carolina. Now, looking forward, what is the formula for building a healthier pro-life movement after Roe than it was before Roe? Abortions were happening and will continue to happen, whether they're legal or not. The law is a deterrent, but it will take more than the law to overcome the combination of the fear and shame of a woman facing an unexpected pregnancy who thinks abortion is her only option, and a physician willing to accommodate her at the right price. If we want to significantly reduce the number of abortions, we need the strength of our pro-life values backed up by the law, along with increased assistance from support networks, especially churches. Now, looking at the lowering rate of abortion in this country in recent years, despite the legality of abortion, we can safely say that this reduced rate is due in significant part to the culture of life we have already built up through our current support networks. Even so, going forward, we need to continue to speak honestly and compassionately about abortion in our church communities. Our pastors need to speak about it from the pulpits. Some pastors may fear that since there is someone likely in their congregation who's either had an abortion or is closely connected to someone who has, that speaking about this topic might be too painful, and they might fear as coming across as judgmental. What those who have had an abortion experience need is love. They need healing. They need someone who will reach out to them with an open hand and surround them with a warm embrace. We need to make clear 2 important truths. First, that human life is sacred from conception, and ending that life is a great sin and will carry consequences seen and unseen for the rest of your life. The other truth is that God's grace is sufficient to cover that sin. And if you accept his love and forgiveness, we're not saying the pain associated with abortion will ever entirely go away, but he will give you peace, he will give you his awesome love, and he will give you the capacity to share that love with others. We need to overcome that shame, that helplessness when faced with an unexpected pregnancy. As Christians, we cannot be so focused on the sin of extramarital sex that led to pregnancy that we lose sight of the blessing that is that new child. We need to show them how to live with the child going forward. Some think their life is ending. It's not, but it is changing. I encourage you all, when you get back home, to get your churches engaged. And if they already are, wonderful. Let me give you an example of what churches can do. Most of you know about the great work done by pregnancy help centers. I've had the privilege and the honor of meeting some amazing female peer counselors at various centers, many of whom are mothers themselves. What motivated me to volunteer as a male peer counselor was one Sunday morning in church when our pastor gave a few minutes to the director of a local pregnancy help center. And this director stood up there at the pulpit and talked about how the center needed male peer counselors. And I had known about pregnancy help centers, but it just had never occurred to me that they would need men to be peer counselors. The director explained that they needed men to talk with boyfriends of the women who came into the center for help. Usually, it's the woman who makes an appointment for herself, and the boyfriend comes along for support. So many times, a male counselor's interaction with the young man is very informal, maybe in the lobby. Most of the time, the guys are surprised to even see another guy there. And you end up spending some time getting to know them, getting to know about their situation. What I would hear more often than not from these young men is that they are totally supportive of whatever decision their girlfriend wants to make regarding the child. It's an understandable attitude that's ingrained into our culture because we are consistently taught that the decision whether or not to keep a child is a woman's choice, and legally it is. But here's where reality and human nature butt in. When I compared notes afterwards with the female peer counselor, what the female counselor is hearing from her client is, he doesn't want this baby. So though men are constrained by the law, in practice, when a woman is on the fence about keeping the baby, the father's opinion is usually the most important. What I tell these guys is that if you want that child, you need to tell her, not only do I want that child, but I'm going to do everything in my power to care for and support that child. Someone close to me and significantly older once said, in 5 of the 6 times when he knew someone who had had an abortion, if the father had just stepped in and said, I want that child, there would not have been an abortion. So to guys out there, if you have a guy friend who's involved in an unexpected pregnancy situation, I encourage you to talk with them about that, what they want, talk with them about, their dreams, talk about the pride that comes in seeing your own child, that precious life, that it's okay to be scared, that you're willing to help, that there are others willing to help, that an unexpected child may change the plans you had, but life in general will change your plans, and your life will be so much richer with that child in it. You all are the pro-life generation. Think about what you can do to help a friend who's pregnant. Drive her to a pregnancy help center. Drive her to her doctor's appointment. Just talk with her. Be a sounding board for her thoughts, her hopes, her plans, her fears, and be a source of encouragement. If you know someone dealing with an unexpected pregnancy, offer to babysit while they're at school or at work. Use whatever talent or resource you possess to help them. If you don't have a friend facing an unexpected pregnancy, there are thousands of others who are. Go to a pregnancy help center and volunteer. Start a fundraiser at your church or your youth group to purchase maternity and baby supplies and donate them to pregnancy help centers. You can also help support young fathers, mothers, and preborn children from the policy side. There are family policy councils in 40 states across the country. If you live in Virginia, you can join our PAGE, our intern program at the Family Foundation. And we have material over there you can check out. If you're a PAGE with us, you could be in the General Assembly chamber and committee rooms as we are pushing now to pass the Protect Women Restoration Act, which will restore all the protections for preborn life that the General Assembly stripped away here 2 years ago. That includes full informed consent, including a 24-hour waiting period, ultrasound and safety regulations for abortion clinics. And those regulations make a difference. Pregnancy help centers will often hear from women who've had abortions years or even decades in the past. I recently talked with a board member and longtime volunteer at a local center here in Northern Virginia that saw so many more women coming to their center just days or weeks after having an abortion than they ever had before. In Virginia, we're also working hard to pass a 20-week abortion ban by March. Now, that might not sound as good as Mississippi's 15-week ban, but when you consider that abortion in Virginia is currently legal for practically any reason through 26 weeks, this is an important step. The law is important. It can be morally instructed. But as we've talked about, the law is only a part, and arguably not even the most significant part, in building a pro-life culture in this country. Building that culture requires the capacity to live outside yourself, to think about and live your life for others, for those scared young mothers and fathers facing an unexpected pregnancy, for those preborn children, and to inspire others to do the same. When you leave this summit, when you go home, I challenge all of you to think about one thing you can do, just one thing, to support someone facing an unexpected pregnancy, and then do it. That's how we do more than just make abortion legal. That's how we make abortion unthinkable. God bless you all.